Will you marry me? 6 months ago, James Walker stepped off a military transport onto American soil carrying a duffel bag and a 6-year-old boy. Now the woman next door was asking him to be a husband. He had no idea what to say. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that felt earned. Wide lawns, slow mailmen, sprinklers going off at the same time every morning, like everyone had agreed on it years ago. People here had lived beside each other for decades without ever needing to know each other's last names. James moved in on a Thursday in April, 6 months after he came home from his third tour overseas. He didn't bring much: a duffel bag, a toolbox, and a boy who carried nothing at all. The house was a rental. 2 bedrooms off Callaway Street, a leaky faucet, a back door that wouldn't close right. James fixed both within the first week. After that, he kept finding other things to fix. The loose step on the porch, the cracked gutter along the east side, the kitchen cabinet that swung too wide and hit the wall. He worked with a steadiness that had nothing to do with urgency. It was just the only way he knew how to be still. The neighbors noticed him, the way people notice something they don't have a ready word for. A black man alone with a brown-skinned boy who didn't look like him, in a neighborhood where most people looked like each other. Nobody said anything directly, but curtains moved. The woman across the street, Carol Lee, somewhere in her 60s, with a voice built for church committees, was the most consistent. She wasn't cruel about it. She just happened to be at her window every time James pulled out of the driveway. Every time he walked Isaiah to the end of the driveway to catch the school bus. Every time he hauled firewood from the back of his truck or dragged the trash can to the curb, just happening to notice, happening to be there. James was used to being watched. He'd been watched his whole life, first through the institutional windows of group homes, then through the lens of expectation in uniform. The watching itself had never been the hard part. What came after it was harder. The conclusions people reached without asking, the questions shaped to sound like concern. Inside the house, he kept things orderly in a way that felt less like habit and more like control. No photographs on the walls, no decorations on the shelves, just a couch, a lamp, and one chair pulled close to the living room window that faced the backyard. That was where James went every morning before anything else started. Coffee in hand, no phone, just whatever the yard looked like at 6 in the morning. It was usually gray and quiet, and asked nothing from him, and he found that useful. Isaiah had the second bedroom. James had painted it soft yellow because the boy had pointed at a crayon that color at the hardware store. Held it up, looked at it, set it back. That had been enough of a signal. There was a low shelf, a mattress close to the floor after Isaiah had moved it off the frame himself during the second week, and above the small desk, a drawing taped to the wall. 3 figures, one tall, one shorter, one standing just outside a fence, slightly apart from the other 2. Isaiah had drawn it in the first week. He hadn't explained it. James hadn't asked. The boy was 6 years old with a quietness that went deeper than shyness. He had picked up English faster than anyone expected, faster than the caseworker had thought possible, but he used it selectively, as if words were something he didn't want to spend carelessly. He watched everything around him, not with anxiety, with the attention of someone who had understood early that paying attention was worth more than reacting. What he loved was drawing. He drew on the backs of grocery receipts, on the margins of his school papers, in the notebooks James kept buying him without comment. He never labeled anything, never explained, but if you sat with his drawings long enough, they told a story. The woman next door had been looking for a while. Sharon Davis had moved to Callaway Street 3 years earlier after the end of a marriage she didn't discuss in detail. She taught second grade at the elementary school 4 blocks away, left early every morning, and came home each afternoon with chalk dust on her sleeves and a patience that felt either deeply genuine or very well practiced. James hadn't been able to tell the difference, and he wasn't sure it mattered. She had started small, a casserole dish left on the porch with a sticky note, too much for one person, a wave across the yard in the mornings when their schedules crossed. One afternoon, when Isaiah had been standing in the rain, waiting for James to unlock the front door, Sharon had walked over and held her umbrella over the boy without turning it into anything. Just stood there until the door opened, then kept walking. Isaiah remembered that. James had seen it from the window and filed it somewhere he hadn't yet decided what to do with. At night, her house was always lit. Not every room at once, just the ones she moved through. From his chair, James could trace the shape of her evenings by the lights. Kitchen first, then the living room, then the back bedroom, always last. It was the only place on that street that looked like someone was actually home. He told himself he didn't think about it much. He was wrong about that. The morning Sharon asked her question was a Tuesday in early October. The kind of morning that couldn't settle. Drizzle coming and going, the sky the flat gray of old concrete. James was crouched in the driveway with Isaiah's foot in his hand, working the laces through the eyelets of the boy's sneakers. He'd watched the tutorial the night before, the kind made for kids, a calm voice walking through every step, and he still got the bows slightly uneven. Isaiah looked down at them each time without complaint and accepted them as they were. Sharon came down the sidewalk at her usual pace, umbrella open, bag over her shoulder. She would have passed right by if she hadn't stopped. James looked up. She stood there for a moment, looking at the two of them in the driveway. The man on one knee in the wet concrete, the boy standing patient as a post. And then she said it. "Will you marry me?" James stayed where he was, lay still in hand. He waited to see if more was coming. "I'm not joking." Sharon's voice was level. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Isaiah looked at her, then at James. His face stayed even. James stood slowly. "You've been thinking about asking me to marry you. The two of you are struggling." She said it without pity. Just observation. "I live alone. I have more than I need. I think we could help each other." It wasn't the kind of proposal built for telling later. No candles, no emotion dressed up as performance. Just a woman on a damp sidewalk talking straight before the day had properly started. And maybe because of that, because it had nothing extra attached to it, it was harder to brush off than something adorned would have been. "I need to think about it." James kept his voice steady. Sharon nodded the way someone nods when they've already allowed for that answer. She adjusted her umbrella and kept walking. No hesitation, no second glance. As if she'd suggested splitting a grocery run and didn't need a response right away. Isaiah watched her until she rounded the corner. Then he looked at James. James looked back at his son and found he had nothing useful to say. The bus came and went. He stood in the driveway afterward with the drizzle settling on his jacket and the umbrella still folded in his hand. That afternoon, Carol Lee found a reason to cross the street. She knocked on Sharon's door with a container of leftover soup, but it was her expression that carried the real purpose of the visit. "I saw you two this morning." Carol said it before Sharon had fully stepped aside. Sharon accepted the container. "That was kind of you." Carol tilted her head in the way people do when they want what they're saying to sound like a favor. "I just think someone should ask. Do you actually know what you'd be getting into? With him? With that boy?" Sharon looked at her neighbor with a steadiness that left no gap to step through. "Thank you for looking out, Carol." She closed the door. Carol stood on the porch a moment. Container gone, question unanswered. Then she walked back across the street. That night, James sat in his chair and watched the dark yard and did not sleep. He kept returning to the way Sharon had said it. Not, "I think we'd be good together," or "I've been feeling something." The kinds of things people said when they wanted to leave themselves a way out. She'd said, "Marry me," plain and level, the way people speak when they mean exactly what they're saying and nothing more. He'd spent most of his adult life building situations he could manage. 3 tours had trained him to read a room, calculate what was coming, stay ahead of it. He had gotten good at it, and then he came home, and there was a 6-year-old who needed someone to tie his shoes, and he was watching a tutorial made for preschoolers at 11 at night. And now the woman next door wanted to be his wife. He didn't know what to do with any of it. What he kept coming back to was Isaiah's face that morning. The boy hadn't looked startled, hadn't looked confused. He had looked at Sharon and then at James the way he looked at a half-finished drawing, like he already knew what it was going to become, like he was simply waiting for the last lines to be drawn. The next morning, before James was out of bed, the front door opened, soft, careful. He pulled himself up and looked through the window. Isaiah was on the porch in his pajamas, holding a piece of paper. He walked to Sharon's door, set the paper flat on her welcome mat, and came back inside. He hadn't knocked. James put on his jacket and went to look. The drawing showed 3 figures, the same 3 from the wall above Isaiah's desk, one tall, one shorter, one standing outside a fence. Except this time, the fence had a small door cut into it, and the door was open. James stood on the cold porch, holding the drawing in both hands for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and went back inside. An hour later, he knocked on Sharon's door. She answered with her coffee, without much surprise on her face. She had already seen the drawing when she left for school. "I'll do it," James kept his voice level. "But I need you to understand something. I don't know how to be in a family. I never had one growing up. I'm going to get things wrong, probably more than once." Sharon looked at him steadily. "So will I." He thought about that. It was, he realized, the most honest answer anyone had given him in a very long time. "Then we figure it out as we go." He didn't extend his hand. She didn't reach for anything. They stood in her doorway in the gray morning, 2 people who had each lost more than they talked about, agreeing to try something neither of them had any real preparation for. When James came home, Isaiah was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a paper bag he was drawing on with his free hand. He looked up. James sat down across from him. "She's going to come stay with us." Isaiah looked at his bowl for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod he gave to things he already knew. That evening, he went to his room, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and drew 3 figures standing under the same roof. The tall one, the shorter one, and a woman near the door. Not leaving, just arrived. Sharon moved in on a Saturday with 1 rolling suitcase and 4 boxes of books. She didn't bring curtains or throw pillows or anything that would announce she was redecorating. She took the second closet in the hallway and put her books on the empty shelf in the living room, and that was mostly it. They didn't use the word married. They didn't use the word family. They were 2 people who had agreed to share a roof and figure out the rest. And for the first 3 weeks, they treated each other with the careful courtesy of strangers who didn't want to take up too much space. Sharon cooked in the evenings, not elaborate things, just real food, the kind that made the kitchen smell occupied. James fixed whatever was wrong with the house, which was more than he had originally thought. Isaiah moved between them both, quiet as ever, watching with the patience of someone waiting for a picture to come into focus. There were small things that were harder than they should have been. Sharon rearranged the kitchen one afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just moved the mugs to a lower cabinet and the cutting boards to the drawer by the stove. She hadn't mentioned it. James came in for water that night, reached for where the mugs had been, and found empty shelf. He didn't say anything, but he lay awake longer than usual. And in the morning, he was at the kitchen table before the coffee finished brewing, working through something in his head that he wasn't ready to name. Then there was the afternoon Sharon dropped an entire bag of flour. It went everywhere. The counter, the floor, her hair, the front of her shirt. She stood there looking at herself and then started laughing. The helpless kind that doesn't need an audience. Isaiah, sitting at the table with a juice box, looked up and laughed too, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a child who has decided something is safe. James was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He watched his son's face, that undefended expression, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. The feeling surprised him so much that it immediately frightened him. He went back to the garage. The thing about Sharon was that she asked small questions, not the large ones people usually wanted to ask James, the ones about where he'd been, what he'd seen, whether he was doing all right, whether Isaiah was adjusting. She asked things like, "How many sugars do you take in your coffee? And do you want the last of this? Or should I save it?" They were nothing questions, negligible questions, the kind that filled space without demanding anything. But James had never had anyone ask about his preferences before. Not about the small things, not about him separate from his circumstances. He found himself answering carefully, like a man who'd been handed something fragile and wasn't sure of his grip. 3 weeks in, the call came from the county. A woman at the Department of Children and Family Services introduced herself and said a concern had been reported regarding the welfare of a minor in his home. She was courteous and gave nothing away. A home visit would be scheduled. James knew who had made the call. He didn't say it out loud. Sandra Thompson arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, a woman in her 50s carrying a clipboard and a weathered professionalism that had seen too many homes to be moved easily by any single one. She walked through the kitchen, the living room, Isaiah's room. She looked at the drawings on the wall without comment. She looked at James the same way. When she sat down at the kitchen table and asked him to describe his household arrangement, James said, "We're friends." From the kitchen, without turning around, Sharon said, "We're husband and wife." Sandra wrote something down. James looked toward the kitchen, and Sharon turned just enough to meet his eyes. She wasn't apologizing. Sandra told them there would be a formal evaluation in 30 days. She would need to assess stability, routine, the child's adjustment, and the nature of the relationships in the home. If the home did not meet the standard required for legal guardianship, the county would have to consider alternative arrangements for Isaiah, on a temporary basis, while the case was reviewed. After she left, James stood at the kitchen sink, washing the coffee mugs she had used. Sharon came to the doorway. "I should have asked you first. I'm sorry." James set a mug down on the drying rack. He stood still for a moment, with his hands on the edge of the sink. "No," he said it quietly. "Thank you." Then he picked up the next mug. Sharon came in and picked up a dish towel, and they finished in silence. The kind that had started quietly to feel less like distance and more like company. Isaiah came home from school on a Thursday and walked straight past the kitchen without stopping, which was not what he usually did. He went to his room, closed the door most of the way, and sat at his desk with his notebook open and his pencil in his hand. He didn't draw anything. He just sat there. James had been in the garage when the bus came. He noticed the closed door, finished wiping down his hands, and came to stand in the hallway. He watched through the gap. The boy, the blank page, the pencil, not moving. He knocked on the doorframe and went in. He pulled the small chair out from beside the desk and sat down. "How was school today?" Isaiah looked at the blank page. James tried again. "Did something happen?" Nothing. He stayed in the room for a while longer, not pushing, not filling the space with more words. Just present. But it wasn't enough, and he knew it. He could feel the inadequacy of it, the way you feel a tool slipping in your hand, doing exactly what it's supposed to, and still not reaching the thing you need. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and tried to think of what a person did in this situation, what a father did. He didn't have a model to work from. Nobody had ever sat in a chair beside him and waited. Sharon came home 40 minutes later with her bag over her shoulder and chalk dust on her right sleeve, the way she usually did. She saw James at the counter and read the house in less time than it took to set down her bag. She didn't ask what had happened. She just went to the table, sat down, and pulled a notepad from the stack near the fruit bowl. She took a pen and drew a house. Simple, 4 lines and a triangle on top. The kind of house a child draws first when they're learning what a house is supposed to look like. Then she pushed the notepad down the table toward the hallway. Isaiah appeared in the doorway. He looked at the notepad, then at Sharon. He came to the table and sat down. Sharon slid the pen toward him. He looked at the blank house for a long time. Then he picked up the pen. He drew 3 people inside, simple figures placed with intention. One near the back wall, one near the window, one near the door, a house that held people without crowding them. Sharon looked at the drawing. "Who is this?" Isaiah pointed to each figure in turn. "Dad, Miss Sharon." He touched the last one. "Me." James was at the kitchen doorway. He didn't go in. He stood with one hand against the frame and watched his son name the people in a house that was also apparently theirs. The back of his throat tightened. He turned toward the wall, pressing his forehead lightly against the doorframe. Outside the window above the sink, the yard was going dark, the last light going gray at the edges of the fence. He stood there and kept his breathing even, but his eyes were wet. That was just what they were doing. After a while, Isaiah reached under the table and picked up his sketchbook. The first one James had bought him, the cover soft from handling. He opened it to the first page and slid it across the table to Sharon. She looked at it. The drawing on the first page was older, the lines more tentative, the proportions unsteady, in the way of a child just beginning to make sense of the page. But the image was clear. A large figure bent low, arms out, reaching toward a small figure standing alone. And beside the large figure, slightly apart, a second adult, one hand placed flat against their chest, as if something had caught there. "That's Dad," Isaiah said it plainly. He pointed to the bent figure. Then he pointed to the figure with the hand on its chest. "That's you. I drew this the first week we were here, before you moved in." The room was quiet. "I knew you were going to come." Isaiah said it not with any drama, just the way he said most things, plainly, because the fact was simply a fact to him. Sharon sat with the sketchbook open in front of her and did not speak for a moment. She looked at the drawing and then at the boy, and something in her face opened, the way a room opens when a window is finally unlatched. She said it quietly, more to herself than to anyone. "I used to think a family needed to look a certain way to be real." Isaiah looked at her. "Someone told me that once, when I wasn't enough on my own to make one." She smoothed the edge of the sketchbook page with her thumb. He was wrong. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to, but the sentence stayed in the room, the first time she had offered something of herself without being asked. And both James and the boy received it without pressing for more. James, still at the doorframe, looked down at his hands. The calluses along his palms were from years of work. Ropes, tools, concrete, steel. He had earned every one of them doing things he believed needed doing. He had crossed oceans and come home. He had learned to tie shoes from a video made for toddlers. He had painted a room yellow because a small child had pointed at a crayon. And this child, this boy, who had learned too early that asking didn't guarantee an answer, had drawn him into a home before they'd even moved into one together, had drawn a woman into that home beside him before she'd ever knocked on their door. James pushed back from the doorframe and walked quietly down the hallway. He went to the back door, stood with his hand flat against the wood, and looked at the dark yard. He stayed there until his hands were steady again. Then he went back to the kitchen and put a pot of water on the stove, because dinner still needed to happen, and that was a thing he knew how to do. The warmth of that evening did not carry forward the way James had hoped it might. It wasn't that he decided to pull back. There was no decision. It was more like weather arriving, gradually settling in without announcement. One morning he skipped the chair by the window. The next he worked until close to midnight, came in after Sharon and Isaiah were already asleep, and ate a cold plate standing at the counter. The dinner had been left covered on the stove. He washed the dish when he was done and left it on the drying rack, and went to bed without turning on any lights. He told himself he was busy. There was always something to fix. But what was true, and what he couldn't bring himself to sit with, was that the evening with the sketchbook had gotten too close to something. And getting close to something was how you set yourself up to lose it. That was the pattern he had lived by for as long as he could remember. Not because anyone had taught it to him in words, but because the evidence had accumulated quietly across his whole life. That good things were borrowed, not owned. That warmth was the thing right before the cold. Sharon noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman who read second graders for a living, 8-year-olds who couldn't tell you what was wrong, but whose whole bodies broadcast it. James didn't stand a chance. She didn't say anything for almost 2 weeks. She kept the morning steady, kept dinner on the stove, kept her presence undemanding. But there were small signals. She stopped asking about his coffee. She stopped moving through the kitchen with the ease that had been building. She became more careful, more exact, the same way a person moves when they're no longer sure they're welcome somewhere. One evening, after Isaiah was in bed, she knocked on the open door of the garage where James was working. "Do you want me to leave?" He looked up from the workbench. "No." "Then I need you to stop treating me like I'm already gone." James set down what he was holding. He tried to find the right thing to say. Some explanation that was honest without being the kind of honest that made everything worse. But the real answer was that he didn't know how to do this differently. He had never stayed put long enough in anything to develop another way. Sharon looked at him across the garage. The tools hung in rows on the wall behind him. Everything in its place, everything controlled. "I'm not here because I ran out of options." Her voice didn't waver. "I'm here because I decided to be here, and I can decide differently." It wasn't an ultimatum dressed as calm, it was just the truth stated plainly. "But I can't do this if you're going to spend every good moment waiting for it to end." She went back inside. James stayed in the garage for a long time after that, sitting on the stool with his hands in his lap and nothing in them. The letter from the county arrived that same week. Formal language, county letterhead. The evaluation with Sandra Thompson would proceed as scheduled. The letter also noted that additional information had been submitted by a community member raising concerns about the household environment and the primary guardian's suitability. If the evaluation resulted in an unsatisfactory determination, the county would initiate temporary alternative placement proceedings for the minor child while the case was under review. James read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer under the workbench with the other paperwork. He didn't tell Sharon about it. He told himself it was because he didn't want to worry her. But the real reason, if he'd been honest enough to find it, was that the letter had confirmed something. The voice in the back of his head had been saying all along that the ground he was standing on had never been his. That the people who had the authority to decide what happened to Isaiah would look at him and see exactly what had been reported to Sandra Thompson. A man who wasn't stable. He started sleeping less, started checking the locks twice before bed, started recalculating the way he used to calculate exit routes, figuring out before anything happened who was at risk and from what and how to reduce the damage. He didn't see yet that the damage he was calculating for was already being caused by him, quietly, every day. The night before Sandra Thompson was scheduled to arrive, James was still awake at midnight when he heard Sharon's voice from the other end of the hallway, low, not carrying the kind of volume people use when they don't want to be overheard. He wasn't trying to listen. He was going to the kitchen for water, but the words reached him anyway, in pieces. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." A pause. "I understand why he is the way he is. I do. But I can't live in a house where someone looks at me every day like I'm about to disappoint them." Another pause. Longer. "I'm not asking him to be fixed. I'm just asking him to let me in. And he won't." He stopped where he was in the dark hallway. He went back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the room dark around him. He thought about the letter in the garage. He thought about Sandra's clipboard and the county's language about alternative placement and suitability. He thought about the way Sharon had become more careful, more contained, because he had made her feel like she had to be. He thought the most honest thing I can do is step back. The logic of it felt clean, in the way that wrong things sometimes do when you've been awake too long. Sharon deserved a real choice, not the one she'd made when she didn't know yet what staying would actually cost her. And the evaluation tomorrow would go better, he told himself, if the household dynamics weren't complicated by something that wasn't working. He took a notepad from the nightstand and wrote one sentence. "I think Sharon should have room to make her own choice without me standing in the way." He left it on the kitchen table. Then he took his keys, went out to his truck, and sat in the dark driveway with the engine off. He told himself he would go back inside after an hour. He stayed until nearly 3 in the morning. Sharon found the note when she came out for water. She stood at the kitchen table in the low light and read it. She read it again. Then she looked up at the wall across from the table. Isaiah had taped one of his drawings there the previous week. The 3-person house, the one with all of them under the same roof. It was still there, undisturbed, right where the boy had decided it belonged. She looked at that drawing for a while. Then she went to the guest closet and got her suitcase. She moved without hesitation, folding things and setting them in the bag with the deliberateness of someone who is making sure every action is intentional. She was not running. She had been a woman who made decisions with both eyes open her entire adult life, and she was making one now. She could not stay in a house where the man inside did not believe he was allowed to be there. She had learned the hard way what it felt like to be in a space where someone else had already decided the ending. She left her books on the shelf. Before she walked out, she went to Isaiah's door, still closed, the boy asleep, and she slipped a small piece of paper underneath it, just a name and an address, no explanation. She knew Isaiah would understand. He always understood. Then she left. The house was quiet behind her. Isaiah woke at his usual time, 6:15, the way he always did. He found the paper on the floor just inside his door. He read it, folded it once, and held it in his hand. When he came out to the hallway, he turned toward Sharon's room out of habit. The door was open. The bed was folded back into the shape of an unoccupied room. Her shoes, which she usually left by the door, were gone. He didn't call out. He didn't go looking. He went back to his own room, and when James came in from outside 20 minutes later, he found Isaiah standing at the wall above his desk. Isaiah was taking down the drawing, the one with the 3 figures he'd put up the first week. He took it down, smoothed the tape marks, folded the paper in half and in half again, opened the top drawer of his desk, and set it inside. He closed the drawer, then he sat down at the desk with a blank piece of paper and didn't reach for a pencil. James stood in the doorway and watched all of it. He thought about the boy on the train, silent, dry-eyed, staring forward, as if he'd already learned that making noise didn't bring people back. He thought I taught him that, not with words, not with any intention, but he had come home from a war and built an orderly, defended, half-empty life, and a 6-year-old had been watching all of it and learning. He had taught Isaiah exactly what he did not want him to know. James sat on the front porch step with his hands around a mug that had gone cold. The morning was clear and still. The street hadn't woken up yet. No sprinklers, no car doors, just birds moving through the trees along the fence line. It was the kind of quiet he used to want. Now it sat on him like weight. He kept returning to moments he thought he'd gotten past. The afternoon Isaiah reached up and took his hand in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, small fingers threading between his without warning. And James had let his hand go loose instead of closing around it, because closing around it meant it could be taken away. The evening at the kitchen table, when Sharon had laughed at something Isaiah said, and James had felt the table and the light and the whole ordinary fact of the moment as something almost unbearable in its goodness, and had found a reason to leave the room. Every time he had stood at the edge of something real and chosen the doorway instead, he had crossed oceans, he had carried a child home, he had learned to tie shoes from a video and painted a room yellow from one gesture. He had done all of that, and then when it counted, he had written a sentence on a notepad and sat in his truck in the dark and told himself it was the generous thing to do. The door behind him opened. Isaiah came out in his socks, which he knew he wasn't supposed to wear outside. He sat down on the step beside James without asking if that was all right. They sat there together for a while, looking at the empty street. Then Isaiah said it. "Do you know why I don't cry?" James looked at him. "Because you don't." Isaiah said it simply, not as accusation, just as information, the way he reported most things he had observed. "I learned from you." James didn't say anything, but I want to cry. Isaiah's voice stayed even. "I want Miss Sharon to be here." James set the cold mug down on the step beside him. "I know." They sat without speaking for another stretch. A car turned onto the far end of Callaway Street and moved slowly past. Isaiah watched it until it was gone. "Are you?" Isaiah asked. James looked at his son, the steady dark eyes, the set of his jaw, the patience that no 6-year-old should have had to practice as much as this one had. "Am I what? Do you want her here?" James held the question for a moment. He had become very good at holding questions until the feeling behind them passed, but he was sitting on a cold porch step beside a child who had put his drawing in a drawer instead of on the wall, and the feeling was not passing. He nodded. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was a single movement of his head. And it cost him something, not because it wasn't true, but because he had spent so long pretending it wasn't. Isaiah looked at him for a moment longer. Then he reached into his pajama pocket and held out the small, folded paper Sharon had slipped under his door. "She left this for me, in case you needed it." James took the paper. He opened it. A name, an address, 12 minutes away. He looked at his son. Isaiah stood up, brushed off the back of his pajamas, and went inside, leaving the door open behind him. The address led to a narrow two-story near the edge of the school district. James sat in the truck outside for a moment before going up. Sharon answered the door, still in the clothes she'd arrived in. She looked at him without surprise. She stepped aside, and he came as far as the entryway and stopped. He didn't know where to start, so he started at the beginning, the real beginning. He told her about growing up in the foster system, about moving between homes often enough that he'd stopped unpacking his bag all the way, because packing again was easier if you'd never really settled. About how he'd gone into the military, partly because it was the first institution that had wanted him without reservation, and how even there he'd made sure never to need anyone more than they needed him, because needing someone was how you ended up standing in a hallway watching their door close. He told her that the evening Isaiah had shown her the sketchbook had been the closest James had come to something he wanted to call home, and that the wanting of it had frightened him so badly he'd spent the following weeks methodically taking it apart. "I wrote that note because I thought I was doing the right thing." His voice stayed level. "I told myself you deserved a real choice. But the truth is, I was just doing what I've always done, leaving before I could be left." Sharon stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms at her sides. "I know why you do it. I understood that before I knocked on your door. I know you did. That's not the same as being able to live with it." "No." James kept his eyes on her. "It's not." He took a breath. "Isaiah told me this morning that he doesn't cry because I don't, that he learned it from watching me." Sharon's expression shifted. "I don't want him to carry that, and I don't want to keep being the reason he has to." He paused. "I can't promise I'll get this right. I have too much evidence against myself to promise that. But I need you to know that I don't want you to go, not because of what you do for us, because of what it feels like when you're there. And I have never said that to another person in my life." The room stayed quiet. Sharon looked at him the way she had that morning in the rain, straight, clear, without anything decorating it. "Do you believe you deserve to be happy?" He thought about it, not the way he used to dismiss questions reflexively with a redirect, but actually thought about it, there in someone else's entryway with his keys in his hand. "I'm learning to." Sharon nodded once. "Then that's the right answer." She went to get her suitcase. They drove back to Callaway Street and pulled into the driveway with minutes to spare before Sandra Thompson was due. Isaiah was at the kitchen table with a glass of juice and the blank piece of paper from earlier. When the door opened and Sharon walked in behind James, he looked up. He didn't make a sound. He reached for his pencil and began to draw. Sandra arrived at 10 with her clipboard and the same measured professionalism she'd carried the first time. She moved through the house again, kitchen, living room, Isaiah's room. She looked at the shelf where Sharon's books had returned to their place. She noted the tools James kept by the back door. She looked at the drawing on the kitchen wall, the three figures under a roof, still exactly where Isaiah had put it the week before. Undisturbed, Sandra sat at the kitchen table and asked Isaiah how he liked living here. Isaiah looked at her for a moment. Then he got up, went to his room, came back with a folded piece of paper from his desk drawer, and opened it flat on the table in front of her. 3 figures under a roof, the tall one, the shorter one, and the woman near the door. Not leaving, just arrived. Sandra looked at it for a long time. She wrote something on her clipboard. Then she looked across the table at James. "I'll finalize the paperwork for legal guardianship this week." After Sandra left, James stood at the kitchen window. Across the street, Carol Lee was at her window, as always, watching. The following afternoon, she appeared at the door with a covered plate, her posture carrying something different from her usual self-assurance, more careful, less certain she'd be well received. "I made too much." It was the same sentence people always used, but her voice had lost its supervisory edge. She held the plate out with both hands, and there was something in the gesture that was as close to an apology as Carol knew how to come. James looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider. "You want to come in? Coffee's on." Carol looked past him into the kitchen, where Sharon was at the table, helping Isaiah with something. The two of them bent over a piece of paper together. She stood at the threshold and took in the ordinary, unremarkable fact of a family in a kitchen. "All right, just for a few minutes." Isaiah looked up when she came in. He met her eyes and gave her a single nod, brief, easy, the kind he gave to people he had decided were going to be fine. Carol sat down at the table. Nobody mentioned what she had reported to Sandra Thompson. Neither side needed it said aloud. Some things are understood without being named, and the understanding itself is enough. The days that followed had a different texture to them, not louder, not more demonstrative, just steadier. James stopped skipping the chair by the window. Sharon stopped moving through the house like a guest. Isaiah drew with the kind of focus that suggested he was documenting something ongoing rather than inventing something he hoped might happen. One Saturday morning, James found himself in the backyard with a tape measure and a rough sketch on the back of an envelope. Sharon came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one without asking if he wanted it. "What are you building?" "A bench. Along the fence there." She looked at the south fence line. "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I want to," she smiled. "That's reason enough." By the end of the month, the bench was finished. Low, weatherproofed. The kind of project that had no urgency and no deadline. Just something he'd wanted to do and done. Isaiah claimed the middle section of the backyard as his territory and spent weekend mornings there conducting what James could only describe as research. Small structures from sticks and stones. Experiments whose logic was known only to the boy. Results recorded in his notebook with the focused privacy of a serious scientist. On those mornings, James sat on the porch with his coffee. Sharon sat beside him. That was the whole of it. 2 people on a porch watching a child work. And James had come to understand that more than he'd had before was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only unit of measurement that had ever made real sense for a life like his. The following Saturday, the neighborhood association held a community barbecue at the park 4 blocks away. James hadn't planned on going, but Sharon mentioned it in passing, and Isaiah looked up from his drawing with something like interest, and before James could construct a reason to decline, they were walking down Callaway Street toward the smell of charcoal and the sound of too many conversations happening at once. The park was crowded, families clustered around picnic tables, children on the playground, a long grill manned by a rotation of men in baseball caps who took the work more seriously than it required. James kept to the edges with Isaiah beside him, and Sharon moving between the clusters of teachers she recognized from the school. Carol Lee was there, near the drink table, talking to a small group of women James recognized by sight, but not by name. She saw him. Their eyes met across the lawn. She excused herself from the group and walked over. "James." She acknowledged Sharon with a nod. "Sharon, Carol." There was a pause. Not awkward, just the space where something was being decided. "I was wrong about you." Carol said it loud enough that the women by the drink table could hear. "They're a real family. Maybe more real than most of us." One of the women, Margaret Allen, called over. "How do you know?" Carol didn't look away from James. "Because I watched them choose each other, every single day." James held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, brief, silent, the kind of acknowledgement that closed a chapter without needing to review it. Carol nodded back and returned to the drink table. The women shifted to make room for her again without comment. Sharon came back with 3 paper plates. They found a spot under a tree and ate without much conversation. Isaiah finished first and went to watch the older kids on the playground. James and Sharon sat in the shade and watched him watch them. "You didn't have to do that." James said it quietly. "Do what?" "Say we're husband and wife. To Sandra, to anyone." Sharon looked at him. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because if I didn't believe it, why would anyone else?" James thought about that. It was the simplest answer, and also the only one that mattered. Isaiah came running back, not because anything was wrong, just because he'd seen something that required their immediate attention. A kite caught in a tree, someone's father trying to retrieve it with a long stick. The 3 of them walked over, and James assessed the situation with the kind of efficiency that made the man with the stick step back gratefully. 5 minutes later, the kite was down. The child who owned it was delighted, and James found himself shaking hands with people whose names he still didn't know, but whose faces had started to become familiar in a way that didn't feel like surveillance anymore. On the walk home, Isaiah ran ahead with a pinwheel someone had given him, spinning it in the late afternoon light. Sharon walked beside James in the easy silence of 2 people who had stopped measuring their sentences before speaking them. When they got back to Calloway Street, Isaiah went straight to the backyard to test whether his structures had survived the afternoon. James and Sharon sat on the porch. The pinwheel was stuck in the grass near the fence, spinning slower now as the wind died down. The street was quiet in the way it always was at this hour. Everything settled, everything in its place. James looked at the house, the one he'd moved into with a duffel bag and a boy and a list of things to fix. Most of those things were fixed now. The faucet didn't leak. The door closed right. The step didn't wobble. But there were other things he hadn't known needed fixing, things that had nothing to do with tools or technique, and those were the ones that had taken longer. He thought about the sketchbook, about the drawing Isaiah had made before Sharon ever knocked on the door, about the way the boy had known something before the adults had the language for it. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether children saw the world more clearly because they hadn't yet learned to mistrust what they were looking at. Sharon shifted beside him. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking. About? About how I almost walked away from this." He gestured toward the yard, toward Isaiah and the structures and the pinwheel, from all of it. "But you didn't." "No, but I came close." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Close doesn't count." James looked at her. She was right. Close didn't count, only what you actually did. And what he had done, in the end, was stay. Not because he'd figured everything out, not because he suddenly knew how to be the person Isaiah and Sharon needed, but because staying was the only way to find out if he could learn. Isaiah came back to the porch with dirt on his knees and a question about whether caterpillars could see color. Sharon answered him with the kind of patience that suggested she'd answered similar questions 1,000 times before and would answer 1,000 more without complaint. James listened and realized he didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to be there when the questions came. That night, after Isaiah was asleep, James sat in his chair by the window. Sharon was in the kitchen finishing something for school. The house was warm and lit and occupied in a way it hadn't been when he first moved in. He could hear her moving around, the small sounds of someone making a life in a space they'd decided to claim. And, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the quiet didn't feel like waiting. It felt like being home. By July, the yard had become a different place. James had built the bench along the south fence, the kind of project that had no urgency and no deadline, just something he'd wanted to do and done. Isaiah had claimed the middle section of the back lawn as his territory and spent weekend mornings there conducting what James could only describe as research. Small structures from sticks and stones, experiments whose logic was known only to the boy. Results recorded in his notebook with the focused privacy of a serious scientist. On Saturday mornings, James sat on the porch with his coffee. Sharon sat beside him. That was the whole of it. Two people on a porch watching a child run. And James had come to understand that more than he'd had before was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only unit of measurement that had ever made real sense for a life like his. Isaiah came running back to the porch one morning, kite trailing. He stopped in front of them both. "Are you and Miss Sharon married?" He was 6.5 now and had recently decided that things should be named correctly. James looked at Sharon. Sharon looked back at him with the expression she'd perfected over these months, the one that said she was not going to rescue him from this, not officially. Isaiah considered this. "But are you going to be?" "Soon." Sharon's voice was matter-of-fact. Isaiah turned without ceremony and went back to his kite. The wind had picked up. He had work to do. James held his coffee and watched him go. There are families built from bloodline and paperwork and the accumulation of years. And then there are the ones assembled from wreckage, from people who arrived at the same place from different directions, each carrying the specific shape of what they'd lost, and who found without planning it that the missing pieces fit each other's gaps. James had come home from war not knowing how to be still. He learned by staying. Isaiah had come home not knowing if home was something that would hold. He drew it into existence before anyone else believed it could be real. Sharon had come not to rescue anyone. She came because she recognized something in the two of them, a door left open that she understood how to walk through. They were not a family because they'd been born to it. They were a family because they had all, at some point when it would have been easier not to, chosen to remain. And sometimes that is the whole story. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect words, just the quiet daily act of deciding, I'm still here. I'm not leaving. This is where I belong. The paperwork from the county arrived on a Thursday. Legal guardianship finalized. Sandra Thompson's signature at the bottom, a paragraph in bureaucratic language that meant Isaiah was his, not temporarily, not conditionally, just his. James read it 3 times standing at the mailbox. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and went inside. Isaiah was at the kitchen table with a sandwich and a book someone had given him about space. He looked up when James came in. "We got the letter. You're staying." Isaiah nodded once, the nod he gave to facts that confirmed what he already knew. Then he went back to his book, the chapter on black holes. James watched him for a moment, the boy who had crossed an ocean with nothing, who had learned a new language and a new world, and had somehow still found room to teach the man who was supposed to be teaching him. Sharon came home an hour later, and James showed her the letter. She read it without expression, and then set it on the counter. Good, that was all she said, but her hand found his and stayed there. And that was enough. That evening, after Isaiah was in bed, James pulled out the folder he'd kept in the back of the hall closet. Documents from the adoption agency, medical records, the single photograph they'd given him of Isaiah's mother, a woman he'd never met, a woman who had died giving her son the chance to leave a place that would have consumed him. He had looked at the photograph exactly twice since bringing Isaiah home. Once, when they handed it to him. Once the night he'd decided to say yes to taking the boy. He hadn't looked since, not because he was avoiding it, but because he hadn't known what he was supposed to feel when he did. He looked now. The woman in the photograph was young, younger than James had been when he joined the service. She stood in front of a building he didn't recognize with her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't not smiling either. She just looked like someone who knew the camera was there and hadn't decided yet what face to give it. Sharon came to stand beside him. He didn't put the photograph away. That's her. Sharon looked. She didn't ask questions. She just stood there with him in the hallway under the dim overhead light and looked at the face of a woman neither of them would ever know. She gave him everything. James's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. I know, and I almost gave it back. But you didn't. He thought about that, about how close he'd come to writing that note and walking away and letting the county decide where Isaiah went next, about how easily it could have gone differently, about how many moments there had been where the wrong choice was also the easier one. Sharon took the photograph from his hand and looked at it again. She trusted someone she'd never met to take care of her son. That takes a kind of faith I don't think I'll ever understand. James looked at her. Or maybe she just didn't have another choice. Sharon handed the photograph back. Maybe, but she still made it. And you honored it. That's what matters. James put the photograph back in the folder and the folder back in the closet. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. Sharon had already gone back to the kitchen. He could hear her putting away the dishes from dinner. The small, ordinary sounds of a Thursday night in July. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would make a story worth telling. But standing there in the hallway, James understood that this was the story, the unremarkable nights. The dishes put away, the child asleep in the next room, the woman in the kitchen who had asked him to marry her on a wet sidewalk and then stayed even when he gave her every reason to leave. He went to the kitchen and picked up a dish towel. Sharon handed him a plate. They worked in the silence that had become comfortable. When they finished, Sharon poured 2 glasses of water, and they sat at the table. Not because there was anything to discuss, just because sitting at the table together at the end of the day had become something they did. I've been thinking, Sharon ran her finger along the rim of her glass, about actually getting married for real. James looked at her. We're not married now? Legally? No. Practically? I don't know. Are we? He thought about the question. They lived in the same house. They raised the same child. They split the work and the worry and the occasional moments of something close to joy. If that wasn't marriage, he didn't know what was. I think we are. Then maybe we should make it official. Why? Because Isaiah asked, and because I want to be able to say it without qualifying it, and because if something happens to you, I want to be the one who gets to decide what happens next, not the county, not some distant relative neither of us has met. Me. James held her gaze. The practicality of it landed harder than romance would have. This was Sharon. She didn't deal in sentiment. She dealt in contingencies, in making sure the people she cared about were protected even when the worst happened, especially when the worst happened. All right, all right, all right, let's do it. Sharon nodded. No smile, no visible relief, just the same steady acknowledgement she gave to most decisions once they were made. But her hand reached across the table and found his, and this time he closed his fingers around hers and didn't let go. They went to the courthouse on a Tuesday in August, just the three of them. No guests, no ceremony beyond what the law required. The clerk was a woman in her 50s who had probably done this 1,000 times and brought the same efficient kindness to each one. She walked them through the paperwork, asked the required questions, had them sign in the required places. When she asked if they had rings, James shook his head. The clerk reached into her desk and pulled out a small box. People leave them here sometimes, after divorces. I keep the simple ones for moments like this. She handed Sharon a plain gold band, handed James another. They fit, not perfectly, but close enough. The clerk pronounced them married, signed the certificate, handed it to Sharon with a finality that suggested the transaction was complete. But then she looked at Isaiah. "You're a lucky kid, you know that?" Isaiah looked at her with his usual seriousness. He didn't answer right away. Then he said yes in the tone of someone reporting an observed fact. The clerk smiled. "Good. Don't forget it." They walked out of the courthouse into the heat of midday. The certificate was in Sharon's bag. The rings were on their hands. Nothing else had changed, but also everything had. Isaiah walked between them. He reached up and took James's hand on one side and Sharon's on the other. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The gesture was the statement. They stopped for lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long but tasted right anyway. Isaiah ordered pancakes, even though it was past noon. Sharon ordered a sandwich she didn't finish. James ordered the same and ate hers when she pushed her plate toward him. When the check came, Sharon pulled out her wallet. James put his hand over hers. "I've got it. It's our wedding lunch." "Exactly. So I've got it." She let him pay. But she left the tip, twice what the meal cost. When James raised an eyebrow, she just shrugged. "It's our wedding lunch." They drove home through streets that looked the same as they had that morning. Callaway Street was quiet when they pulled in. Carol Lee was at her window. She waved. Sharon waved back. James nodded. Isaiah was already out of the truck and running toward the backyard where his structures were waiting. That night, Sharon called her sister, a woman James had never met but had heard about in pieces. The conversation was short. Sharon's side of it mostly, "Yes, and I know, and we're fine." When she hung up, she looked at James. "She wants to meet you." "When?" "Thanksgiving, if that's all right." James thought about Thanksgiving. 4 months away. A table with people he didn't know. Questions he didn't want to answer. But also Sharon's family. The people who had known her before he did, who maybe could tell him things about her she wouldn't say herself. "All right." Sharon looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." She came over to where he was standing and put her arms around him. Not a gesture she made often, but when she did, it meant something. He put his arms around her, and they stood there in the kitchen with the light going orange through the window and the sound of Isaiah in the next room. Building something out of blocks that would fall and be rebuilt and fall again. September came, with cooler mornings and the return of school routines. Isaiah went into first grade with the same teacher Sharon had recommended, a woman named Patricia Johnson, who had a reputation for seeing kids other teachers missed. Isaiah thrived, not in the loud way some children do, but in the steady accumulation of skills and confidence that showed up in the drawings he brought home. More detailed now, more intentional. One afternoon he came home with a question. "Miss Johnson says families come in all shapes. Is that true?" James looked up from the invoice he was reviewing. "Yes? What shape is ours?" James thought about it. "What shape do you think it is?" Isaiah considered the question with the seriousness he brought to most things. Then he went to his room and came back with his sketchbook. He flipped to a page near the middle and held it up. 3 figures, not under a roof this time, just standing together, close but not touching. The space between them visible but not empty. Like that. James looked at the drawing, at the way Isaiah had captured something he didn't have words for. The way a family could be whole without being seamless, could be together without erasing the gaps. Yeah, like that. Isaiah nodded and put the sketchbook away. Question answered. He went back outside where the late afternoon light was good for the kind of work he was doing. Sharon came home an hour later and found James still at the table. She set her bag down and looked at him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. He's just... he gets it, you know? In a way, I'm still trying to learn." She came to sit beside him. "He's had to get it. Kids like him don't have the luxury of not paying attention." James knew she was right. But it still caught him sometimes. The gap between what Isaiah understood and what James was still figuring out. The weeks folded into each other with the rhythm of a life that had found its pattern. James took on more repair work in the neighborhood. Word had gotten around that he was reliable, that he showed up when he said he would and fixed things right the first time. The work wasn't much, but it was enough, and it gave him a reason to know the people on the surrounding streets, to be more than the man who'd moved in with a boy and a question mark. Sharon's classroom was full, 23 second graders with 23 different needs and 23 different ways of learning. She came home tired most nights, but it was the kind of tired that came from work that mattered. She didn't complain. She just did what needed doing and then came home and did it again there. Isaiah continued his experiments in the backyard. By October, he had built a structure that looked like nothing in particular, but that he defended with the conviction of someone who knew exactly what it was for. When James asked, Isaiah explained that it was a test. Of what, he wouldn't say, but he documented everything in his notebook and referred back to previous pages with the focus of a researcher building on prior findings. 1. Saturday, James was working on the bench he'd built. One of the boards had started to warp. He was replacing it when Isaiah came over with his notebook. "Can I ask you something? Always, why did you say yes when Miss Sharon asked you to marry her?" James set down his tools. He looked at his son, at the boy who asked questions most adults wouldn't know how to answer, because she was right. We were struggling, and she could help, and I thought maybe I could help her too. Isaiah wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. "But that's not the real reason." James felt his chest tighten. "No? No." Isaiah's voice was certain. "You said yes because you wanted to, but you didn't know you wanted to until she asked." James sat back on his heels. The boy was 6 years old, and he had just articulated something James hadn't been able to put into words even now. "You're right." Isaiah nodded, wrote something else, then closed the notebook. "I think that's how most good things happen. Someone asks, and you find out you wanted it all along." He went back to his structure. James stayed where he was, staring at the half-replaced board, at the tools in his hands, at the yard that had become something other than just a yard. He thought about the morning on the wet driveway, about Sharon's question, about the fact that he'd been given a choice he didn't know he was allowed to make, and how that single moment had led to this. To a Saturday in October with a son who understood things James was still learning, and a wife who had bet on him when he wouldn't have bet on himself. He finished the board, put his tools away, went inside, and found Sharon at the kitchen table grading papers. He sat down across from her. "Isaiah just told me something." She looked up. "What?" "That I said yes to you because I wanted to, but I didn't know I wanted to until you asked." Sharon set down her pen. "That sounds about right. How does he know that?" "Because he pays attention, and because he's had to learn how to read people to survive. It's not magic. It's just what happens when you can't afford to miss things." James thought about that, about what it cost to develop that kind of sight, about what Isaiah had traded for the ability to see what adults couldn't. "I don't want him to have to do that anymore." Sharon reached across the table, took his hand. "Then give him a reason not to. Give him a place where he doesn't have to watch the exits. I'm trying. I know. And so is he. We all are." They sat there for a moment, the papers spread between them, the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that would be gone in another hour. Outside, Isaiah was still working, the sound of sticks being arranged and rearranged, the documentation of something only he could see. Thanksgiving came. Sharon's sister lived 3 hours north in a town James had never heard of. They drove up on Thursday morning with Isaiah in the back seat, reading a book about volcanoes and asking periodic questions about magma viscosity that neither James nor Sharon could answer with any authority. The house was larger than James expected, not ostentatious, just the kind of place that suggested comfort and stability and the accumulation of years in one location. Sharon's sister, Rebecca, met them at the door with a warmth that felt genuine. Her husband, Kenneth, shook James's hand with the firm grip of someone who had decided in advance to like him. Their 2 kids, both older than Isaiah, took him outside to see the trampoline within 5 minutes of arrival. The afternoon unfolded with the organized chaos of a family holiday. Too much food, too many conversations happening at once. The television on in the background showing a football game nobody was fully watching. James found himself in the kitchen helping Kenneth with something that didn't really need 2 people, but gave them an excuse to talk. "Sharon says you're good with your hands. I fix things. It's what I know how to do." Kenneth nodded. "That's a useful skill, especially these days. Nobody knows how to fix anything anymore. They just replace it." James didn't disagree. They worked in silence for a while. Then Kenneth said it. "She seems happy." "Sharon, happier than I've seen her in a long time." James looked at him. "I'm trying to keep it that way." "Then you're doing it right." After dinner, Rebecca pulled Sharon into the other room for what was clearly meant to be a private conversation, but that James could hear pieces of through the wall. Rebecca's voice low but insistent, Sharon's responses measured. He caught enough to understand. Rebecca was asking if Sharon was sure, if this was what she really wanted, if she'd thought it through. Sharon's answer was simple. "I chose this. I choose it every day. That's how I know." When they drove home that night, Isaiah asleep in the back seat, Sharon reached over and took James's hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For coming. For being who you are with them. For not pretending." "I don't know how to pretend." "I know. That's why it matters." They drove through the dark with the road mostly empty and the radio playing low. James thought about Rebecca's questions, about whether Sharon was sure, about whether she'd thought it through. And he realized that those were the same questions he'd been asking himself since the morning on the driveway. Not because he doubted Sharon, but because he doubted his own capacity to be what she needed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the asking itself was the work. The daily choice to stay and figure it out rather than decide in advance it wouldn't work and walk away. Maybe that's what love looked like when it wasn't built on certainty, when it was built instead on the willingness to keep choosing even when you didn't know how it would end. December brought the first real cold, the kind that made the mornings sharp and the evenings something you wanted to spend indoors. James started a fire in the fireplace one Saturday, not because they needed it, but because he wanted to see if he still remembered how. Isaiah sat on the floor with his notebook, documenting the progression of the flames. Sharon sat in the chair by the window with a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. James sat on the couch and watched them both, his family. The word still felt strange, but less strange than it had, less like something borrowed and more like something earned. That night, after Isaiah was asleep, Sharon came to sit beside him on the couch. The fire had burned down to coals. The house was warm and quiet. "I have something to tell you." James looked at her. Her expression was unreadable. "I got offered a job. Assistant principal at a school across town. That's good, isn't it?" "It is, but it means longer hours, more responsibility, less time here. Do you want to take it?" Sharon looked at the fire. "I don't know. Part of me does. Part of me thinks I should stay where I am, where things are stable. What does the other part think? That stable isn't the same as stuck. That maybe I'm allowed to want more even when what I have is already good." James reached for her hand. "You are. You're allowed to want whatever you want. Even if it makes things harder here, even then, we'll figure it out. That's what we do." Sharon leaned against him. They sat like that until the fire went out completely, and the room went dark except for the streetlight coming through the window. She took the job. Started in January. The hours were longer. The work was harder. But she came home with a different kind of energy, the kind that comes from being challenged in ways that matter. James adjusted, took on more of the morning routine with Isaiah, made dinner more often, found that he didn't mind the shift, that maybe he'd needed something to do that felt like contribution rather than just maintenance. Isaiah adapted without complaint. He always did. But James noticed the drawings changing. More figures now, more complexity. Still the three of them at the center, but others appearing at the edges. Carol Lee, Patricia Johnson, Rebecca and her family. The neighbor 2 houses down, who had started waving when they saw each other. A world expanding beyond the fence. By spring, the house on Calloway Street felt less like a place they were trying out, and more like a place they'd built, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with intention, with a slow accumulation of decisions that added up to a life. One evening in April, exactly a year after Sharon had asked her question on the wet driveway, James came home to find her and Isaiah in the backyard. They'd hung streamers from the fence, set up a small table with a cake. Nothing elaborate, just the acknowledgement that a year had passed, that they were still here, still choosing this. James stood at the back door and looked at them, at Sharon setting out plates, at Isaiah arranging forks with the precision he brought to everything, at the yard that had become a place where a family lived, not a perfect family, not the kind that looked like what people expected, but a real one, built from pieces that didn't match and somehow fit anyway. He walked out to join them. Sharon handed him a plate. Isaiah handed him a fork. They sat at the small table and ate cake as the sun went down. And James thought about all the years he'd spent believing that home was something other people had, something he wasn't built for, something that required a blueprint he'd never been given. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe home wasn't something you were given. Maybe it was something you made, with your hands and your time and your willingness to stay, even when staying was the harder choice. Maybe it was just this, a table in a backyard, a boy with frosting on his face, A woman who had seen him at his worst and decided he was worth the trouble anyway. Maybe it was enough to be here, to have built this, to keep building it, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until the days added up to years and the years added up to a life. And somewhere in there, without announcement or ceremony, you looked around and realized you were home. Not because someone told you that you were, but because you'd stopped wondering where else you were supposed to be. Isaiah looked up from his cake. "Can I show you something?" "Always." He went inside and came back with his sketchbook, opened to a new page, a drawing he'd finished that afternoon. 3 figures under a roof, like always, but this time there was a 4th figure, small, barely outlined, standing in the doorway with 1 foot in and 1 foot out. "Who's that?" Sharon leaned in to look. "I don't know yet." Isaiah's voice was thoughtful. "But they're coming." James looked at the drawing, at the figure that wasn't fully there yet, at the way Isaiah had left space for something he couldn't name but knew was on its way. And he understood what the boy was saying, that families aren't static, that they grow and shift and make room for what comes next, that the story doesn't end when you think it does. He put his hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." Isaiah nodded, closed the sketchbook, went back to his cake. The conversation was over, the observation made, the future documented before it arrived. They sat in the backyard as the light failed, and the neighbors' houses lit up one by one. Carol Lee's light came on, then the house next to hers, then the one across the street. The whole block coming alive with the evidence of people home from work and settling in for the evening. People living ordinary lives in ordinary houses. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. Just the quiet, persistent fact of showing up every day and making it work. And James thought that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.